Do you ever think about where your food comes from? As a thought experiment, think about the last meal you ate. Could you tell me where all of its ingredients came from? You might say that it came from your local grocery store, or perhaps even a restaurant, but where did they get it? I wouldn't blame you if you didn't have that specific of an answer to that question, since it's not really something most people have to think about all that often. Most people's relationship with food is largely centered around consumption. People go to the store, buy a bunch of groceries, bring it home, cook it, and eat it. While consumption is the most visceral part of food, food doesn't magically manifest itself out of thin air. In a video game, you can have a town with tons of residents and no fields that is somehow able to feed itself, but that doesn't really work in real life. In real life, food must be produced. My home has given me some insight into the nature of food production. I grew up in Iowa, and if Iowa is known for anything, it is known for its agriculture. If you look at those maps made for elementary schools, Iowa is always represented with a piece of corn, a pig, or some other farm-related thing. Aside from being known as the state who historically has held our election caucus before anyone else, Iowa is known as one big farm. And this is true. But this reputation alone doesn't convey how much food we make. In 2022, Iowa harvested 2.48 billion bushels of corn, making it the largest producer in the country. It has led the nation in corn production for over 20 years. We also produce a staggering amount of pork. We also produce more eggs than any other state, in addition to providing significant amounts of other goods. Farms use 30.5 million of the state's 35.8 million acres, or roughly 85% of the state's land. In comparison, California, the third largest state in the country, only has 24 million agricultural acres. Simply put, Iowa grows a lot. With this in mind, it's inevitable that pretty much every Iowan has some connection to agriculture. For me, this connection came from my grandfather and uncle, who have been farming in Iowa for decades. Growing up, my whole extended family would host reunions on this farm to celebrate birthdays and holidays, and as a result, I spent a not insignificant amount of time playing games on this farm, trying to coax the farm cats out of their timid shells, and exploring. As I got older, I started shucking corn after the harvest, or picking grapes from my uncle's vineyard. Even without a personal connection, farming is such a large aspect of Iowan culture that nobody can fully escape it. Our universities offer degrees in a whole web of fields related to food and its production. Food is the bedrock of our economy, and thus becomes the subject of significant legislative efforts. Growing up in a place where food production is so culturally important has given me an interest in thinking about food and where it comes from. And frankly, I think it is important for everyone to give this subject some thought, because everyone is impacted by how we produce food. Iowa is an agricultural powerhouse, but that comes at a cost, not just for us, but for the whole world. We now live in a globalized economy where goods can be transported further and faster than ever before. This hasn't always been true. In previous historical eras, food production was incredibly localized. Preserving and transporting food used to be incredibly expensive, and only the wealthiest individuals could afford to import food from faraway lands. For most people, their food was grown and cooked by nearby farmers and chefs. There's a decent chance that you might have known some of the people responsible for growing your food back in the day. This is less true today. Because of advancements in preservatives and transportation, shipping food long distances is more achievable than it has ever been. In some regards, this is a good thing, allowing food-dense regions to donate their excess food to regions in need, such as the humanitarian efforts spearheaded by Herbert Hoover to donate food to Belgian and French civilians during World War I, feeding 9 million people, undoubtedly saving many lives. However, I also feel that our globalized food industries have had negative consequences, especially where these consequences overlap with capitalism. Ultimately, one of the costs of globalized food production is that the methods we use to make food have consequences for everyone. As a local example, consider Iowa's use of fertilizer. Crops need certain nutrients like nitrogen and phosphorus from the soil to grow properly, but these aren't always replaced naturally after a harvest. Farmers, in an effort to counteract this, use fertilizers to reintroduce these elements into the soil, resulting in greater yields of healthier crops, at least in the short term. However, plants can only absorb so much fertilizer, and the excess nitrogen and phosphorus is washed into water sources like rivers by rain. Much of this runoff ends up in the Gulf of Mexico. Neither nitrogen or phosphorus are toxic, but both are classified as nutrient pollutants because of the disastrous impact they can have in the water. To vastly simplify a complicated process, nitrogen and phosphorus greatly increase the growth of algae past healthy levels. As this algae dies, it is consumed by bacteria, which consumes the water's oxygen levels faster than photosynthesis can replace it, causing the water to suffer from hypoxia and making the area unlivable for fish and underwater creatures. This has resulted in the Gulf of Mexico dead zone, a region so devastated that it can support almost no life. Iowa agriculture contributes significantly to the Gulf dead zone, despite being miles away. The consequences of food production impact everyone. This is just one impact of Iowan agriculture, but I could list dozens of others. When most people interact with food primarily through consumption, it's easier to mask just how many steps go into making food. Farmers need to buy seeds, large farm vehicles, chemicals. They need fuel for those vehicles, labor to spend time planting those seeds. Irrigation is often used, in addition to naturally falling water. Fertilizers and pesticides are applied. Food is harvested, and the crops have to be shipped out for further processing. This often involves trucks, which also need to be fueled. The path a food takes through processing can be long and winding, but generally different chemicals are applied, removed, and delivered. Eventually, a major food brand gets their hands on their ingredients, and they make their final product. Put it in packaging. Again, it gets shipped off to a store chain's distribution center, who loads it onto another truck, so it can be put on store shelves, where it is then bought and consumed. This whole process involves many companies, big and small, and the labor of hundreds of individuals, and at every point in this process, different consequences can arise. If I were to go into more detail about some of these consequences, we could genuinely be here for days. But here are just a few. Trucks are how we transport a lot of food in the United States, and these trucks cause significant wear and tear on our roadways. Agricultural land across the US was stolen from Native Americans by European colonizers. The vast majority of Iowa's native prairie has been converted into farms, harming biodiversity. American food companies use chemicals in their products that the EU has banned for being too dangerous. Almond and alfalfa plants in the American West consume staggering amounts of water, while residents are forced to ration. Grocery stores bleach unsold food supply to stop homeless people from rummaging through their garbage. Food companies lobby Congress to influence the food pyramid. Employees responsible for making and serving food are paid absurdly low wages, with the assumption that tips will just make up for it. John Deere spent years opposing right-to-repair laws preventing farmers from fixing their equipment. Frankly, I could keep going, because food and its production overlaps with so many areas of our lives and impacts everyone. Food corporations don't want consumers thinking about what truly goes into food production, because they benefit when people don't know how the sausage is made. A populace well educated on the nuances of food production can demand for changes in legislation and protest unethical practices. A consumer left in the dark about where their food actually comes from can happily buy their Frosted Flakes and Chef Boyardee. One thing that is particularly apparent about modern food production, and is responsible for many of our food problems, is how we view food as a commodity. Food is something we all need to survive, But capitalism has taken this necessity of life and turned it into an object that is to be bought and sold for a profit. Companies don't grow food because they want to feed people, at least not inherently. They grow food as a means to make money. If this sounds extreme, or you disagree with this point, look at all the ways corporations abandon opportunities to make their food more available to people, make their product worse, disregard the environment, and generally avoid doing the right thing because it might make them slightly less money. Because food is a commodity that is supposed to be used to make money, any system that gives people food for free is a threat to food corporations. It's why in many places giving food to homeless people is a criminal act that will literally get you arrested. To a certain extent, from the corporate perspective, food is grown to make money, and if it just so happens to feed people along the way, that's just a happy side effect on the path to its true goal. I'm grateful to have spent a lot of time in Iowa, since it has genuinely given me opportunities to think about how farming has impacted my communities. During the production of this video, grape harvesting season rolled around, and I worked with my cousin to harvest grapes, destem them, strain them, crush them, bag them, and freeze them for later use. Being able to take something directly from the vine to a more processed state is a useful skill, and is a great jumping off point to talk about the complexities of modern food production. Ultimately, this is a really complicated issue. Part of it goes back to the fact that we do need food to survive. We can't simply stop eating, but we can produce it more ethically. Of course, that is simple to say, but achieving that in reality is a monumental task that, to an extent, cannot be adequately achieved if food production is a commodity to make money. However, there are things that can be done. Legislation can be passed, and political movements can be supported that will make our food production better. It is imperative that we do so, because the consequences impact everyone. However, for that to happen, I believe that as a society, we should know more about our food, and not just with regards to consumption, but also about the behind-the-scenes machine that produces our food. Even if you aren't in a position of power, knowing about all aspects of your food gives you a lot to think about, and is a fascinating lens to examine our world with. So again, I ask, do you know where your food comes from? This video was created as part of a collaborative essay mixtape about food and its place in culture. I'd like to thank Lamhoot for organizing the Food for Thought mixtape. Check out his channel, not just for that video, but a collection of other excellent video essays. This has been Chariot Rider. Have a good day.